saturators, overdrives, compressors, clippers, all the modulation, crazy effects and stuff like that. You can really get creative, and like that's my favorite part about reamping is what you can do before it hits the amp. That's just not possible unless you had like the world's biggest pedal collection.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedictine, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, man. I immediately want to jump into something. Have you or anybody you know gotten to try the Quad Cortex yet?
No, I haven't.
All right. For anybody that doesn't know what the hell we're talking about, it's like the new cool kid on the block in the guitar profiling world. And so like we've talked about Kempers and like there's the Line 6 Helix and Axe effects and stuff, which aren't all profilers, but they're all digital amps that sound pretty darn good. And there's a new one called the Quad Cortex. And my buddy, I won't out him, but he's like in one of the biggest metal bands going on right now. He just sold his Kemper, or is selling it right now, because he's like, there's no comparison, dude. And I am just shocked.
Wow.
So I was wondering if you had like if that had been happening out near you yet, or what's going on.
I mean, I've heard about it, not personally, not from people I've worked with, or like it's not firsthand knowledge, but I've read about it a lot. So I'm sure. I'm sure it's great because everything neural is really great, and like from what I understand, it's not really different than their plugins. It's just their algorithms, their sound running on a piece of hardware, and it can do more than the plugins. But basically, it's, I guess, pretty similar to what they do in the software world, and that is all awesome, and I love it. So I don't like. Of course, it's awesome.
Yeah, no reason to think it's going to be bad. That's for sure. But I guess according to my friend Mike, the capture is like the big thing for him. Like you can just grab any pedal, any amp really easily, no external gear pretty much. You're just like, you just need it and that piece of gear and you're good to go, which is not as easy with the Kemper. It's quite a process. So
I didn't know you could actually capture stuff with the Quad Cortex.
Yeah. It's like a next level capture. Apparently that process has quite improved from the Kemper setup, which is very interesting to me for studio use. That could be really fun. So very interested, but I just wanted to see if it was making the same waves out your way.
Yeah, I think it's just as popular here as it is anywhere, but maybe I'm biased because I love and use Neural and I get their ads all the time, and that we both know Steven, and like, so maybe I know more about it than other people do over here, but I think it's becoming pretty popular here as well. The thing is, though, that the pre-orders or the shipping for those took quite a while, and I know a bunch of people who ordered it, but I'm not sure if they already got their device. So that's maybe why it takes some time to catch up. Yeah,
I think the COVID stuff kind of delayed production, which is understandable.
Yes, totally.
At the end of the day, though, like I haven't listed my Kemper because it's literally sounds like amps. Like it's awesome. I make records that get on the radio with it. So I haven't really, even though there's something that's apparently more fun to use, it's like, well, this sounds fantastic. We've hit that point in guitar amps now where it's like, okay, what we're improving isn't the sound anymore. It's just other features kind of thing. Yeah. So we're in like a golden age of guitar convenience. Yeah, it's fun.
But that's actually a very important thing you just said there. And I want you listeners to really think about that, and like, because it's not only guitar gear, but gear in general. There's always going to be something, like you buy something, you like it, you love it, you use it for a while, and there will be something that comes out that is better than what you have, or seems to be better than what you have. And many people instantly want this new thing and don't like their stuff anymore, and they eventually spend money on the new thing until the next thing comes around, but their work never really improves through that. And it's very important to always remember that no matter how awesome the new thing might be, before you buy it, think about if it's really going to make a difference or if it's just because it's shiny and new and you want it. And I think it's a very, very important thing what Malcolm just said, that he sticks to his Kemper, although there's something that might be better, because the Kemper does the job and sounds awesome, and there's no reason to replace it, even if it's like 10 years old and new stuff is coming out. So that's really, really important, because a lot of people think they can buy their way out of their audio problems, and they jump on every new thing. And we all have that. I mean, I feel that temptation as well. I see something and I want it, but I've gotten better at like waiting for a second, like thinking about it, and then realizing it's probably going to be fun, but I don't think my results will be any better if I buy it.
Right. Yeah, that is a lifelong skill in this industry that you have to keep working on.
Yeah, exactly.
Skill, addiction, I don't know, it depends how you look at it.
That's why there are still, as crazy as it sounds, and I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, but that's why there are still people who make records using like Pod Farm or something like that, you know? Of course, there are better sims out these days, but if it works for them and it's their sound, I mean, why replace it? Something that was like, that's the cool thing about software, but gear in general. Something that was a great plugin or digital amp or whatever 10 years ago is still a great plugin today. Like, it's not that it got worse over the years or anything. It's just there's new options and different stuff, and some things got better. But records sounded great 10 years ago and did it 20 years ago. So
Yep, exactly.
Cool.
Well, today's topic is also about making guitars sound cool. So this is a good segue.
Totally. So we talk about reamping today because I think it was your idea, Malcolm, because we haven't really, I mean, we have a reamping episode, but this was not specifically guitar reamping, but like a how to do creative, about creative reamping techniques, something like that. Like we were talking about some fun ways to use the reamping process or to send stuff through certain gear and create unique sounds with that. But today we talk about reamping in the classic sense of the word, like sending a DI out of your interface into an amp and then capturing that. So yeah, that's basically what it is. And we specifically talk about reamping with a real amp and a reamp box, and not about using plugins. You could call that reamping as well, but that's A, easier to do, and B, there might be conflicting information or confusing stuff. So we just stick to using real analog amps and how to send a previously recorded DI track out of your computer into the amp and then record it back in, how to do that properly.
Yeah. Now, to further confuse you, we are still including things like the Quad, Cortex, or a Kemper, or any external hardware kind of digital amp. That's still included. It's just anything out of your computer. Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I said analog. That's not true. I mean anything out of your computer. Exactly.
Yeah, out of the box versus in the box. By the way, I wonder if everybody's heard that. Okay, that's like a very common term for mixers, but in the box and out of the box. Let's quickly touch on that. In the box means that you're using stuff that is living in your computer, nothing outside of it. So plugins, whatnot. And so when you hear somebody mixes in the box, they don't use external hardware. So you see those big studios full of rack gear. They're not using that if they mix in the box. Where out of the box mixing is using all that stuff. You're sending out of your computer into all that stuff and back in. So in this case, we're talking about out of the box guitar reamping.
Yep, totally. Like I heard out of the box and in the box so many times now that I totally forgot what you were talking about. But yeah, you're probably right.
Sure.
Yes. Exactly. Whatever Malcolm said, in the box and out of the box.
Yeah.
So today, only out of the box reamping is what we talk about. All right, then maybe let's start with, should we explain the process, what it actually is, or did we already do a great job at that?
Let's give it like the 10-second version.
Okay.
You've recorded a clean DI through your guitar tracking, but you've decided you want to change the tone. So you are now going to send it out of your computer into an amp again and re-record that signal in the new tone you want, so that you can have that in your session instead. That is why we're generally reamping.
Yeah. Why would we do that in 2021 if you have plugins?
Maybe you just have the right amp for it. You know, you've got an amp that's the right sound. Maybe your sound depends on like a certain fuzz pedal or something like that. You know, you have to get out and into that pedal to grab that. That would be kind of the main reasons I could think of.
Yeah, there's one more for me. Maybe you carefully like set up a rig that you really liked, and you have your head and your cab and microphones and everything's great. But after recording or after adding additional elements, instruments, when it comes time to mix, you realize that the tone is not quite there, and you want to change, you basically like it, and you can't do the same thing with plugins, but there's something you want to change about it. So you want to go back, maybe move a mic a little bit, change the settings on the amp or whatever, but basically use that setting that you were tracking through, the rig that you were tracking through. So that would be another reason for me that, it's just a safety net sometimes. Sometimes you have a great rig that sounds awesome, but if you also record a DI, you can just go back, change something, and you don't have to fix that with EQ or whatever and in the mix then.
Very true. Yeah, that's a great example. So that's why and what reamping is. There's nowadays it's becoming this thing where people are making records with the full intention of it being reamped at mixing, which is interesting. It's kind of like a new thing that is happening, especially in kind of the format that we're teaching on this podcast, where you're trying to give power to a professional mixer while capturing it with your home jam space setup, right? Which is leading people to record DIs as a priority with the intention of being reamped. Now, that's an interesting conversation because we also try to preach that you should be committing to your sound on the way in. Sometimes you can't. But if you are just tracking a DI with the intention of being reamped, hopefully you're also tracking, like listening to an amp sim, and you can commit that and send it over kind of thing. We definitely, I just want to stress that you should be trying to get a sound that is what you want no matter what. There's not really any excuse to skip that. But you know what? I'm going to touch on that later. I think it's going to make more sense once we've explained some of this stuff, why I wanted to bring that up. sorry, listeners, that's confusing. But
that's fine.
Suffice to say, that's something we've always said is record a DI. And it's because your mixer might be able to do something with that. But it's also make sure you're recording an amp or sending along some kind of monitoring signal that you were hoping it sounded like, it's really hard to make a record with your guitar sounding like DIs, obviously. But how do we do it, I guess, is what we have to talk about now, like the actual physical steps. And that first step is capturing a DI and making sure you get that done right. So I think we should start there, even if it is something we've discussed before. Because actually, I know somebody that had trouble with this very recently. So definitely worth covering.
Yep. Okay. I think the basics are don't clip it, only record as hot as necessary. Like don't go super hot on your interface preamps because some of the cheaper ones, as we said in other episodes, tend to sound a little brittle or noisy if you really crank them. So it's better to, when in doubt, just record a quieter signal. You can always bring it up digitally later. Don't clip it unless it's like intentional, but I would probably do that after it's been recorded. Just to be safe, I would record a clean DI and don't clip it on the way in. Use the right DI. Choose a passive or an active one, depending on your instrument. Choose one that can handle that has enough headroom, that can handle the level. So if your interface inputs, DI inputs, can't handle whatever you're sending into it, you have to use a passive DI box for that. Choose a good one, basically. If you're going to use a DI box, compare it to your interface's DI and use the one that's better. Those are probably the basics. Like the most important being the level, I think, because we've already discussed that there's probably not much difference between a DI box and your interface's input. If you want to use a DI box, use a very good one. If you want it to be better than whatever your interface has, compare it. But that all will not be as important as just making sure you don't clip it and record like healthy levels.
Yeah. Now, I think we can take it back a little bit further and like how do you actually set up a DI, a physical DI?
Okay.
So this can be confusing, and it's where do you place the DI? And I think 99% of the time we're going to recommend sending a DI that is just your guitar. So what we mean by that is where you put the DI in your signal chain is going to change what it grabs. So say you have your guitar, a metal zone pedal, because that's obviously the best sounding pedal on the planet, and then you're hitting your amp. You're going to want to probably, unless you really want that pedal, you're going to want to stick that DI right after the guitar, So because what happens is whenever it gets put in the chain, that's what it's capturing and sending out as its capture. So if you put that after the metal zone, it's going to get a DI signal with that metal zone processing in it. And now, no matter what you do, when you try and reamp it, you're going to be stuck with the metal zone, which would be a disaster, by the way. That's not to say there isn't a time and a place for that. I've definitely had wet DI captures. We call it wet when there's processing in it.
Yeah.
So maybe there's like a really specific fuzz, or sometimes it's cool to capture a delay before it hits the amp or stuff.
That's
like
what
that. It definitely happens. But as like a general rule of thumb, I think you want to go clean, because you can always add that stuff back in another way. You can always add that delay pedal back in the reamp if you want, right? That's always an option. You have total flexibility if you have a clean DI. And I think that's generally worth it. And going back to what I was rambling about earlier, when a lot of people are kind of going with this DI first, DI priority tracking style, where they just aren't set up to get good guitar tones and they're hoping their mixer can help them out, having that clean DI is going to be pretty helpful usually.
Yeah, agree with everything. I'd say if you are tracking a clean DI and have the pedal after the DI, make sure you document the whatever settings you have on the pedal, because my rule of thumb is basically I wanna leave pedals in the chain that change the way you play, if that makes sense. Like things you interact with as a player, like delays, for example. And so sometimes I do that. I put that before the DI just because it's part of the performance, more or less. It's part of the performance more than an effect. That's not the case for a metal zone usually, but some delays or some modulation effects, you just interact with it. It has a timing element to it, and sometimes I want to capture those things. You can still put it after the DI to be safe, but then I would really document it carefully so that you can get it that you can recall it if you need it, because it could be hard to recreate the same thing after the fact in the box or during reamping if you don't know exactly what settings you had, because it's an interaction between the player and the pedal sometimes. So that's just what I would do.
Yeah. Now, this really comes back to, again, the conversation of if you are tracking with DI as your priority, you're still the producer, right? You're still producing your own record. The mixer isn't. So you have to kind of make those decisions. Is this pedal that you are putting in your chain before the DI, is it essential to the performance? Is it really like, you have to make that sonic decision, right?
Yeah.
Because that, if you put it in the DI, your mixer is going to have to use it if they're reamping.
Yes.
So you kind of have to put that foresight in and make that call.
Yeah. Same thing. Sorry, the same thing is obviously true if you're not mixing yourself and you send it somewhere and you have some sort of DIY self-built pedal or some unique or boutique thing that no one else has. In that case, you have to capture it. Like if you want that on the record, you obviously have to capture it, because you can't assume that whoever you're sending your stuff to has all the same stuff that you have. If it's something very common, they might be able to get something similar or the same thing. But if it's something super unique or like something you've built yourself, you obviously need to capture it if you want it on the record.
Right. Yeah. And this is, again, the importance of sending along some kind of amp tone that represents what you were aiming for at the very least is so important, just so the mixer knows that you were trying to get something in that vein. They can't read your mind. So that helps a lot. Now, I want to quickly tell you that you can have more than one DI. You can have a dry and a wet DI. So you could have one at the beginning of the chain and one after your pedals as well, and grab both of those. I've done that a handful of times. I've never ended up using it, but but in theory it was there, so that's cool.
Yeah,
a little bit more work, but it's totally possible. You do need external DIs to do that, I guess. And actually, you need an external DI to do any kind of pedal capture. You can't really do it with like the interface one, because I mean you could send back out, I guess. Yeah, but then you'd have to capture it again. I don't know if that would work.
What do you mean? Like if you want to do both, like dry and wet?
No. So if you're just doing one, so you've got a 2-channel interface and you're using the high Z inputs,
and you don't want to capture the pedal. That what's you?
Yes, you don't want to capture the pedal, but you want to use the pedal hitting the amp.
Yeah.
You are kind of stuck, right?
Yes.
So a huge advantage of an external DI, if you're thinking about getting one, is that there is something called a through output. And it's just a split. It just sends the clean signal out, or whatever is hitting the DI signal. That is getting split before it goes on towards your amp.
Yeah.
So you kind of like, it's a Y box in a way.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to say. Like there is one thing you can do instead of using DIs if you really like the DI input on your interface, or you already have a DI, but you need an additional channel or capture, whatever. There are instrument splitter boxes that you can use. There's I had one that I really loved, the Lele P-Split, it was called. Lele is the company, Lehle.
Cool.
P-Split is the model. It's a super amazing thing. Built like a tank, sounded awesome. You can flip the phase between the two, like the two channels that go out of it. They are separated very well. There's no crosstalk. There's no noise issues. You have a ground lift. You have all of those things. And I loved using that splitter. I just split it up between two preamps or two DI inputs or a DI box, any interface, whatever. Or I used it to send one guitar into two amps at the same time. So
Cool.
there are splitter boxes like that. There are, I think Radial makes 4-channel or even more splitters, like where you can have like 4 amps at the same time. So this is an alternative to DI boxes if you still have the DI inputs, obviously, but you can split the signal before whatever rig you're hitting.
Yeah, they're actually becoming more popular. I think with like Royal Blood coming up, a lot of bass players have been getting splitters and like the Radial ABY box and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so they're out there. Okay, so we've covered capturing the DI. There's capturing it wet or dry, and making sure that you also have a representative tone that your mixer can either use or at least reference for then reamping later. But also keeping in mind that you might want to reamp. That's why we're teaching it. Obviously, it's good for you to understand how it works, even if you're not doing it. But it's a lot of fun too, so you might like to do it.
Totally.
You need a reamp box. This is something that people aren't always aware of. There is a specific tool that you need, and it is called a reamp box.
Yes.
And what this does is allows you to come out of your interface, and then you're coming out at line level, usually, I guess. And now your amp is going to be expecting like a high Z impedance, right? So you have to hit a reamp box, and then which is going to kind of convert it to the right level, and then hit the amp. So most reamp boxes look like DIs, by the way, but they're not. They're different.
Yes, they're different. You're coming out as like as a line signal, and you want to convert that into an instrument signal, basically, because otherwise, you want to match the impedance, you want to match the level. Now, I want to say something. I've had this conversation with a couple of people, and I know that it can work in theory, but I wouldn't recommend it. Some people use, and they've asked me this a bunch of times, some people use passive DI boxes in reverse for this. They just use that instead of a reamp box. I would not recommend that. I've heard examples where it worked, but I've also heard examples where it sounded weird. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it depends on the DI box you're using. I just know that it's not a reliable way to do it. So I would just, those are not too expensive. I would just get a reamp box or get like an all-in-one thing like the Little Labs Red Eye that can do everything like split, reamp, active, passive DI, everything like that. Like just get a proper solution for those things, because I don't think there is a good reason to save a couple of bucks for like instead of buying a reamp box. Just do it properly. There are these devices made for that purpose. Just get one. Like I would always recommend that. I mean, you can experiment, of course, but I would do it the right way.
I totally agree. It's just you're kind of asking for it to sound terrible if you're not using the right stuff.
Yes. So the reamp box. There are passive ones, active ones. There are I've tried some different ones where one of the main differences was always the level that they send it at. Like I compared even a couple of passive ones, and some were quieter than others for whatever reason. So maybe you got to experiment with that a little bit, and you do comparison. Yeah. But I would say, as always, if you go with a trusted brand, something like Radial or whoever makes like reamp boxes these days, who also makes DI boxes, or like the well-known brands who make that stuff, you can't really go wrong. Again, I wouldn't experiment too much here. I would just go with something trusted, do a little research, see what other producers use, and just get one, and you'll probably be fine.
Totally. Yeah. Now, some reamp boxes, like I've got the Radial Active one, and it has a gain on it, like a trim, so you can kind of adjust the volume coming out of it right on the box. But you actually also have that opportunity in the computer as well, in the box. So that brings us to the next thing that you absolutely need is on your interface, you have to have some additional outputs to use. Because if you can't send out of your interface, you can't get to the reamp box, you can't get to the amp, obviously, right? And some interfaces don't have that. Like the Focusrite Scarlett 2-channel one doesn't have any extra inputs. So if that's your interface,
Outputs.
you're kind of you're out of luck. Oh yeah, outputs. Any extra outputs, you're out of luck there. There is the speaker outputs, but they're attached to the monitor control on that box. So don't try that. I did try that, didn't work.
Yep.
I like stupidly. Side note: I had that interface, and I bought like a lunchbox and with some external stuff, and figured out I couldn't use it after I bought it all. Like, what the hell?
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was an impulse buy. But back in the day,
Yes.
So you need extra outputs, and that's as you get more expensive interfaces, there's all these extra ins and outs, and that's what you're paying for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess we should talk about the technical side of that, though. You're in your session, you've got your clean DI, you have to set an output on that channel to whatever output is free on your interface, and then you're going to use a TRS cable probably coming out of that into your reamp box. And with that send you've created in your session, you can then control the volume that you're sending to that output as well. Now, in general, I just put that at Unity, which means you put it at 0 dB, and that's usually great. But you can experiment with hitting it harder or softer as well.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to get into that, but on the output side of things, it's the opposite of what you do on the input. Like on the input, I would record as quiet as possible when in doubt. On the output side, it can be worth getting close to 0 and using all the dynamic range you have on your output, because like I don't want to explain now that this is too much for this episode of the podcast. Just know that your DA conversion, like digital to analog conversion, sounds the best if you use all the bits, all the dynamic range, and that means going out with a hot level digitally, and then when in doubt, turn it down on the analog side if you have a trim on your reamp box. That's better than going out very low, because the noise floor of your output, like it's better or worse depending on the device you have, the interface you have, the converter you're using. But the noise floor will be the same. And if you go out very quietly and you then turn it up before you hit the amp, it will be noisier. If you go out pretty loud, the difference in level and volume between your actual signal and the noise floor will be bigger. And if you don't have to crank it up afterwards, the noise will be lower. So it's worth turning it up to the point where you don't clip your converters, but you're going out with a reasonably loud level.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don't clip, go loud.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. That's how you do it. And Unity is a great place to start. I would probably don't touch the send. I would just make sure that the actual track you record, like I would probably use clip gain or something like that. I would make sure that the DI is just captured with a healthy level, and then I would probably leave the send at 0, and then I would adjust, or like go out as loud as possible without clipping it, but then turn it down or up, whatever, on the analog side if you have that trim. There is this phenomenon where you would think that the recorded DI should sound the same as compared to when you plug your guitar directly into the amp. And even if you match levels, which you should, to get the same distortion, the same amp characteristics, but even if you do that, the DI out of the computer through the reamp box almost always sounds different compared to a guitar plugged into the amp directly. So you might not only need to adjust the level that comes out of the computer to match whatever level your guitar sends into the amp. You might also want to do tiny EQ tweaks. And that sounds a little advanced, but it can mean that you maybe boost the top end just a tiny bit, just a very broad shelf to brighten it up a little bit. Or it might mean that, whatever difference you're experiencing, it's just likely that if you compare it, that it's going to be a little different. Now, that doesn't matter if what you're starting with is the DI that you reamp and you never heard the actual signal from the guitar into the amp, then it doesn't matter. Just create a tone that you like. But if you captured something with the guitar directly into the amp before and you want to recreate that and maybe just change it a little bit, then you need to make sure that the DI, you match the sound of the DI to whatever your guitar sounds like. That's the difference here. If you didn't do that, if there's no real amp capture and you don't want to recreate anything like that, it doesn't matter. Just create a tone you like, just as you would with like in a normal situation. But whenever you want to recreate something, you got to make sure you match the DI, because otherwise you'll be wondering why it doesn't sound the same, and it can be pretty frustrating. But the reason is the DI is going through 2 conversion stages and also through the reamp box, and there's just a bunch of stuff in the chain that is not there if you plug directly into your amp.
Yep. It's just going to be different. You just got to live with it and adjust. And the same is true for the through output on a DI. It's always different than just hitting the amp with one cable. I think that's almost always worth it, but it is just different. It's just part of life. But this being able to tweak it by adding some EQ or something before it leaves the computer and hits your reamp box and then hits your amp is honestly the most powerful and fun part of reamping. It is this whole, once you wrap your head around that you can do that, you can do anything. You've got your whole computer worth of plugins to mess with your guitar tone now. And so imagine having an unlimited pedal board.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want to that signal before it hits your amp and just get things that are not possible in the analog domain, really. It is so fun, and you can really just tweak it so accurately. Let's be honest, the EQs on amps are really cavemen.
Yeah.
It's and half the time they don't do what they say. If you have a Marshall, it's just what the hell is this thing?
Yeah.
It's filling up space. I'm not sure if it's attached. But with in the box, you can pull up this really cool surgical DI where you can see exactly what you're doing, do all types of different things. You've got all your saturators, overdrives, compressors, clippers, all the modulation, crazy effects and stuff like that. You can really get creative, and that's my favorite part about reamping is what you can do before it hits the amp. That's just not possible unless you had the world's biggest pedal collection.
Yes, totally. You can do 3 things. You can be creative, as you just described, Malcolm. You can just come up with cool sounds. You can compensate for whatever flaws your instrument might have. Maybe you have a pretty boomy sounding low end, whatever. You can filter it a little bit. You can make it tighter before you hit the amp. Maybe your guitar or the strings you chose or whatever are a little dull. You can brighten it up a little bit. You can compensate for whatever you don't like on your instrument or strings or whatever. And then the third thing is you can learn so much about how amps or your specific amp reacts to different signals. That alone is worth it, and it's worth experimenting with it, because not only can you get creative, but you can see where the limits of the amp are. How much low end can you put into this? How much level can it take before it breaks up? Does it break up in a different way if you clip the DI before you hit the amp? Is all those things. Is a mid-range push maybe cool? Some amps sound really awesome if you can with some amps you can boost insane amounts of mid-range before the amp, but it doesn't sound really good if you do it after the amp. So there's also all sorts of things, and you can learn so much about how an amp or your amp reacts to the incoming signal, which then informs future decisions. Maybe for the next record, you're going to choose a different guitar or different pedals or whatever, because now you know that last time it was so cool to boost a bunch of low end into the amp, and now you want to use a bassier instrument next time or whatever. You just learn your gear that way, and you have unlimited possibilities to do so if you use your plugins before the amp.
Definitely. Yeah, it's really fun. It's the most creative part of this process, I think.
Yes.
I guess we should talk about your favorite, Benny, the real-time reamping.
Yeah, exactly. So what I like to do, this sounds a little complex, but I really like that workflow, is I sort of reamp while I'm tracking guitars. And what I do is I take a guitar cable from the guitar, from the output of the guitar, and I plug it directly into the interface or a DI and then the preamp, the converter. So I go direct in without anything in the chain. So I basically record the cleanest DI possible, the shortest connection to the computer. Then I would send the output of the channel that I'm recording to, of that DI channel in the DAW. I would send that out through an output into a reamp box and into a real amp. And then I would capture the real amp, I would put a microphone in front of it or capture the Kemper output or whatever it is and record that on another track. So that track is what I listen to. So that requires you to have a setup with very low latency, because you monitor what you monitor is going in the computer, out of the computer, and back in the computer. So 3 conversions.
Mhm.
And so, of course, you need low latency in order to do that, a very low buffer size. And the cool thing is about that, you'll just listen to your amp, but you also already listen to the changes that the reamping signal chain does to your amp.
Mhm.
And and the reamp is already set up. What that means is you can play, you can have a very, very good take, but then you're like, you know what? In this part, it would be actually cooler if we would use, I don't know, a delay in front of the amp, or if we would change the sound a little bit. Now you don't have to play that part again. You just instantly you just hit play, record that part again, tweak the amp, and there you have it. Like the reamp is already set up, and you can, while you're producing the record, while you're recording the guitars, you can just instantly do a reamp, change the tone a little bit, and then move on. You can, while you record, track through your unlimited pedal board. Like you can say, okay, in this part, you know what? Let's try this virtual like delay pedal, or this part of guitar rig, or this module of the, I don't know, neural DSP, whatever. And you can just insert pieces of software guitar gear in your chain, send it out in real time through the amp, and just use that as pedals while you record. And you can change that from part to part. And if you don't like it, it's not a problem, because it's virtual. You always have the clean capture. You can do whatever you want with it, but you have all the options, and you can listen to that in real time while you're playing and interact with all of that stuff. So I really like that. Like if you can do it, if you can get the latency to be low enough so that this works, it's a workflow that I really, really enjoy.
Very cool. One thing that I think is worth mentioning, and this might be the last thing, I guess, is that when you do a reamp, there's usually a timing delay latency thing. It's often very small, but it exists. So when I do a reamp, I make a little like blip on the DI channel at like beat 1, start of the session kind of thing. And then when I record it through, I go find that blip and then realign it to that same beat or bar. And that just ensures that my performance is timed back to where it originally was. That I don't know if that makes any sense in podcast format, but essentially it's just, you have to imagine that by leaving your computer and going through all of this processing again and coming back in, there's going to be some delay. Like it just won't line up perfectly. So we're just compensating for that. And it's much easier if you make a little marker for yourself in the DI signal rather than trying to like line up this fuzzy amp capture.
Yeah, absolutely. You totally have to do that. Like as I said, you have 3 conversions. You like 2 conversions from the DI, from the moment the DI is captured, and yeah, you totally have to align that. I was just thinking about 3 because of my real time reamping setup that I'm so used to now, and because I have to align the timing. I absolutely have to do that. I can't just record with that setup and then say I want to blend some amp sim with the real capture. I can't just put a plugin on the DI track and blend it, because the real capture will be late. So I always have to adjust that. But you have to do that always. Like even if you don't do the real time thing, if you just have a DI and you send it out and back in, it's also gonna be late. So the blip totally makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Again, can't stress enough that even if you are planning to reamp your whole album, you still need to be trying to get tones that represent what you're trying to do, so that you can make educated choices for all the other things in your album, and then send those along to your mixer, of course, as well. It seems like it removes the need for you to care about guitar tones when you're capturing a DI, but that is just not the case. So definitely still care about that. Make sure your DI sounds good. That is also a step that is sometimes missed. We're capturing a DI, but it's like, does it sound good? Like you should check it. Sometimes there's a buzz and it's ugly, or like you've never noticed you need new strings when you're listening to the amp because there's all this busy distortion on it. But when you listen to the DI, you're like, wow, this sounds like dead. A DI tells no lies.
Yes, totally. Absolutely. And we should mention one more thing. I totally forgot about that. There is a cool trick. I think we've mentioned it in another episode, but I want to say it again. You can record 2 signals simultaneously onto one stereo track instead of 2 mono tracks. And that can be very, very useful. And I will ask people more in the future to do that, because it's just safer when they start editing and making changes to whatever they recorded. Because it's pretty often that people send me their DI and their amp, and it works fine. And then all of a sudden there's a part where there's weird phasing. And for whatever reason, in that part, the timing shifts a little bit, or they accidentally chose the wrong take on one of the tracks or something like that. And to prevent that, before you do any cuts, any fades, any like editing moves, either like consolidate the two tracks to one stereo track or just track them onto a stereo track and use a plugin where you can blend between the two or just listen to one of the two. You can figure that out. Like there's ways to do that. Like, so what I'm saying is, instead of recording to two mono tracks simultaneously, create one stereo track in your DAW, assign the input, let's say like input 1 and 2. 1 is the DI, 2 is the amp, and then you'll obviously have like one on the left side, one on the right side. So you have to insert a plugin where you can pan the signal to one of the sides and then make it mono so that it comes out of the middle again. So that way you can, with the plugin, you can decide what you're listening to, but it's like baked into one audio file. And if you cut it, if you edit it, it always stays in sync.
Yeah.
That's just, especially for people who are like unsure when it comes to editing, and like they feel that if you feel that you're going to make mistakes, stuff like that, that's just a helpful thing to do.
Yeah, it kind of removes the step and the possibility of accidentally misaligning things. Yeah, like I don't do that. I just group tracks because that's been what I've been doing for over a decade. But for people that are new to this, that's you're totally right. It's just like they don't even need to worry about making a group. Then it's done. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I think that's it. There's not more to this. Again, this includes analog amps as well as digital amps. They behave like, I would just think of them as the same thing. They behave differently, both depending on the signal you send into them. It doesn't matter if it's a Kemper or a real amp. It's same principles apply. They both need a high C. They have a high C input. They need an instrument level going into it. They react differently depending on the level you send into it. And one you capture with a mic or with some, I don't know, load box or whatever, and the other just has an output, but it's the same process.
Right. Actually, one thing worth mentioning is some devices have Reamp boxes built into them, like the Kemper does. For example, the Kemper has one in it, so you don't actually need an external one. I don't know if the other competitors in that market do, but I'll say that my external Reamp box sounds better than the built-in Kemper one. So it's like DIs. There's varying qualities.
Okay, but the Kemper one only works if you connect it digitally to your system? Nope.
No, it's got a hardware Reamp box on the back. Yeah, there's a Reamp return on the back.
Oh, I didn't remember. Okay, I had a Kemper, but I can't remember this. I thought, like, because people do digital reamps with it, like they...
Yes, you can also do that. Yeah,
okay,
that's a good call.
Okay, yeah, that gets too confusing now. But when in doubt, as always, you can't go wrong with a good DI box and a good Reamp box, and then it doesn't matter. Like, you just use those, and then it doesn't matter if it's a Kemper or a real amp; it will just work. So I don't really, especially with things that are not too expensive, like DI boxes and Reamp boxes, I don't really see a need for too much experimentation. It just takes time, and the results won't be that much better. Just grab a good DI box, a good Reamp box, use it, and don't worry about everything else.
Totally. All right. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. See you next week. Bye.